Have you ever heard of expressions like government of the day or the confidence of the house? These are all expressions that we can see in the news or maybe in a conversation, and they all relate to the principle of responsible government. If you want to know what these expressions mean, and if you want to understand how the principle of responsible government works here in Australia, then stay with me until the end of this video. Hello everyone, my name is Renato Costa, this is AUSSIE Law, and today we will look at how the principle of responsible government works in Australia. If you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to click the subscribe button, because that's how you can be sure that you're not going to miss any of our videos. And also like this video, because that will be super helpful for our channel as well. Responsible government is one of the pillars of the Australian political and legal system. This principle was actually one of the resolutions made by Sir Henry Parkes when he was thinking about how Australia should be as a federation. I've made a video about Sir Henry Parkes and you can watch it by clicking on the top right corner. I've also talked about Sir Henry Parkes' resolutions in a video called Australian Federalism Explained. You should also take a moment to check it out if you haven't done that already. So yeah, indeed, responsible government is one of the main principles that will permeate the whole of the Australian federal system. The problem with the principle of responsible government is that it's largely governed by conventions. What it means is that the Australian Constitution doesn't really say expressly that it adheres to and follows the principle of responsible government. So we have to understand it not by reading the Constitution, by understanding a bit of the history and where the Constitution design comes from. Nonetheless, Quick and Garham said that for better or for worse, the system of responsible government, as known to the British Constitution, has been practically embedded in the Federal Constitution in such a manner that it cannot be disturbed without an amendment to the instrument. Interesting. The High Court of Australia has also acknowledged that responsible government is implied by the Constitution and has relied on that principle for constitutional interpretation. In the Wooltops case, for example, Justice Isaac said that the doctrine of responsible government is invisibly, but nonetheless inextricably and powerfully interwoven with the texture of the written word, and any interpretation of the document which disregarded the implication of the doctrine would be false and misleading. So what is it? What is responsible government and how it operates in Australia? Responsible government is a principle that expresses the relationship between Parliament and the Executive. It ensures that the members of the Executive will be accountable to Parliament for their actions and their decisions. In the video I made about the separation of powers in Australia, I said that in Australia we don't have a strict separation of powers except for the federal judicial power. That means that the Executive is born out of Parliament. And that means that the ministers who form the Executive will be accountable to Parliament as a whole. This is the basic idea of the principle of responsible government. Whereas the basic idea of responsible government is about this relationship between Parliament and the Executive, there are many implications and facets to that principle. So here's what I'm going to do. I'll give you a general, broad definition of what responsible government is, and then we'll go through each one of these aspects and I'll explain them to you. Responsible government requires that the Queen or the Queen's representative must act only on the advice of ministers who are members of Parliament and who have the confidence of Parliament, to whom they are responsible collectively and individually, and ultimately to the electorate. This is a general definition, so let's break it down into smaller parts. The first feature of this definition is that responsible government is about the Queen or her representative acting on advice of ministers. I am still to make a video about Chapter 2 of the Australian Constitution, but there, Section 61 says that the executive powers will be vested in the Queen. But the Queen is so far away, isn't she? She's all the way up in England. That's why we have the Governor General, the Queen's representative in Australia. The Governor General of Australia today, the day that I'm recording this video, is Sir David Hurley. He is the representative of the Queen in Australia. So he's the one that is the head of the executive in Australia representing the Queen. Do you know who he is? Have you seen him in the news? No, probably not. That's because his role is more formal than practical. He is not the one really deciding on the directions and managing the application of the laws in Australia. The person who really takes it on his or her shoulders is the Prime Minister. So, formally speaking, constitutionally speaking, when the executive is taking a decision, that decision is being made by the Governor General as the Queen's representative. But the responsibility, ultimately and practically, doesn't fall upon the Governor General. It falls upon the Prime Minister and the ministers that form the executive, the government of the day. This whole framework comes from the idea of trying to protect the Queen from policy making, from getting in the middle of the politics, and also at the same time giving more powers to those who are directly elected by the people. Because the ministers, by the way, are those who are elected to go either to the Senate or to the House of Representatives, and they are the heads of the governmental departments. They are the leaders of the many arms of the executive branch. So, the Queen, or in Australia, the Governor General, will act, but the monarch will only act on advice of the ministers. That is, in practice, the Prime Minister and the other ministers who form the executive branch. Let me just add one thing. This is a parenthesis to what I've just said. Because it is possible for the Governor General to act without the advice of the Prime Minister. That can happen, and I will explain a bit more about that when I make a video about the constitutional crisis of 1975. But for now, all you need to know is that yes, the Governor General can do that, and those are called reserved powers. It's not the same thing as reserved powers that we already talked about. The reserved powers are part of prerogative powers that belong to the Crown and are exercised by the Governor General if he or she wants to. But what the first feature of this definition of the principle of responsible government tells us is that the Queen, or in our case here in Australia, the Governor General, will only act on the advice of elected ministers. The second thing is that these ministers must be members of Parliament. Think with me. If we are trying to shield the Queen from getting in the middle of the political decisions, we must put the responsibility for those political decisions on someone else. That's why the Queen will only act on the advice of the elected ministers. But the ministers also must be accountable to someone. Hence the requisite that the minister must be a member of Parliament. First, because that tells us that the minister will respond to his or her peers in Parliament. But second, because it also informs us that the minister is an elected member of Parliament. Therefore, he or she will be ultimately responsible before the people, the whole of the electorate. In section 64 of the Australian Constitution, there is an explicit requirement saying that ministers of the Commonwealth must be members of either House of Parliament. That is a part of the principle of responsible government that we can find expressed in the text of the Australian Constitution. Another feature of this principle is that ministers must have the confidence of Parliament. What does that mean? Having the confidence means that the majority of the House will support the minister's agenda and policies. If, say, Party A has 60% of the seats in the House of Representatives in Australia, what it means is that Party A will probably have support enough to pass the legislation it wants to. Party B, in the minority, will probably not succeed in doing the same thing. So since Party A has the majority of the seats in the House of Representatives, Party A enjoys the confidence of the House. Now, you already know that there are two houses in the Australian Parliament. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives. So, let me ask you this. Do the ministers have to secure the confidence of both houses? Is it only one of them? Which one of the two? We can guarantee answer that question by saying that the ministers have the confidence of that branch of the legislature which immediately represents the people. Traditionally in the UK, because they have a lower and an upper chamber in Parliament, the confidence of the House will be acquired by the leader of the party that has the confidence of the lower chamber, the House of Commons in the UK. In Australia, the lower chamber is the House of Representatives. And so that's the place where the ministers must secure confidence. It is still possible to have ministers that are part of the government of the day, of the executive, that are members of the Senate. But the confidence must be held in the lower chamber, the House of Representatives. In reality, the question is just a bit more complicated than it looks, because the Senate in Australia is different from the upper chamber in the UK. So, for example, according to section 53 of the Australian Constitution, the Senate can deny supply to the government. And therefore, if the government doesn't have enough people or the majority, the support in the Senate, what it means is that the Senate can actually influence and even take down a government. So it's not that simple. But what is important for you to know is that yes, it is in the House of Representatives that the ministers must secure the confidence. It is in the House of Representatives that they have to have the majority to be the government of the day. This can be said because if the government of the day loses the confidence in the Senate, they don't have to resign. But if they lose the confidence, if there is a withdrawal of confidence in the House of Representatives, then the ministers will have to resign. This brings us to another feature of the principle of responsible government. That feature tells us that the ministers are responsible individually and collectively to Parliament. This is super important because the whole idea, the core idea of responsible government is to regulate this relationship between the executive and Parliament. And this relationship is a relationship of trust, of confidence, of accountability. That's why the term responsibility. To have responsibility is to receive the trust of someone and to act accordingly to that trust and to the limits of that trust that was received. And that trust also makes you responsible for the things that you do and omit doing. This is the essence of the principle of responsible government. Ministers will be accountable, responsible, both individually and collectively. Individually, they will be responsible for the operation of their departments, and they will be held accountable to Parliament by many means. But maybe the most famous one is through question time. But there's also the collective responsibility. That is the responsibility of the whole of the ministry, the whole of the government. The loss of confidence, for example, is one of the ways in which Parliament can hold the ministers responsible collectively. Another way would be cabinet solidarity. But I'm not going to talk about cabinet solidarity here because I want you to subscribe to my channel, click the bell icon, and that way you will be notified when I upload the new video about the executive and I talk about the cabinet solidarity. So do that so you don't miss the video. Finally, it's always good to remember that the ministers are ultimately responsible to the electorate. They exist because of the electorate. The whole machinery of government, the whole of the executive branch, it's all for the people. So the ministers are elected by the people and they will be held accountable for the people, for their actions, for their decisions, for the operation of their departments. Everything they do will be ultimately and politically accountable to the people. This is the core of the democratic principle, and it's also a pillar in the principle of responsible government. So, what is responsible government and how does it operate in Australia? The Governor-General, as the representative of the Queen in Australia, will only act on advice of the Prime Minister, who is a member of the Australian Federal Parliament, elected by the people and who, together with the other ministers that compose the government of the day, enjoys the confidence of the House of Representatives and is therefore responsible both individually and collectively to Parliament and ultimately to the electorate. I've sort of compiled everything that we explained in this new definition of the principle of responsible government. I hope you understood it because we just saw each one of those aspects individually and they all compose what the principle of responsible government in Australia is all about. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're not subscribed yet, do it. And if you like the explanation about the principle of responsible government, also please click the like button in this video. I hope to see you soon. Until then, ciao.